Before we go on, I wanted to say a few things about our speaker tonight. First of all, he's never done this in front of a creation science group. He's taught Sunday school for 40 years, and that can get a little bit wild. He has preached sermons in church. He's preached from the back of a pickup truck. He's talked to college campus groups and all kinds of things, but he's never done this. And so he's going to be doing a lot of reading off the screen to make sure that everything is technically correct. And that's good for you, because if you let him start ad-libbing, you could be here until St. Patrick's Day. So we're going to try to avoid that. And just so that you understand that we're talking about two different people. I am now Dr. Hofmeister, which is how I made a living for the last, how many years? And so this will make me look official, make it look good on the YouTube video later, and hopefully make you think I know what I'm talking about. So tonight, we will be talking about gender dysphoria and following the Creator's science. We're going to start with a word from the English language called euphoria. Euphoria is one of those words that must be experienced to truly appreciate its meaning. It's defined as a feeling or state of intense excitement and happiness. I believe I felt euphoric when we stood at the entrance of Yosemite Valley. Just a breathtaking view, and I highly recommend everybody put it on their bucket list if they haven't already. And just make sure you fill your gas tank before you get there. That's all I'm going to say. I felt euphoria on the day of my wedding, at least until I had to pay for it. I felt euphoria with the birth of my 3 children, at least until we brought them home and didn't know what to do next. I also remember a bit of euphoria on December 31st, 1967, when Bart Starr crossed the goal line with the winning touchdown. Anybody here remember that? Oh, good, a few hands went up. I don't feel so old now. Watching on TV, I felt euphoria. The people who were at Lambeau felt frostbitten. So, there's also dysphoria. Dysphoria is the opposite of euphoria, and it must be experienced to truly appreciate its meaning. It's a sense of unease characterized by generalized discontent and agitation, more than just your normal sadness and grieving. I believe my wife and I felt dysphoric over my son's cancer diagnosis at age 14. Same could be said for when my daughter was 5 weeks old and had spinal meningitis. Of the 3 things, though, my son's undiagnosed Lyme's disease, like 3 years when he was a toddler, that really got dysphoric after a while. So we think we know what that's about. But then there's this thing called gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a sense of discomfort or dissatisfaction or distress due to a mismatch between one's biological sex and their true gender identity. In other words, a mismatch occurs when the body parts say you are male or female, but your brain says you are something else. That something else, at least according to non-binary advocates, gender is a sliding scale between 2 extremes. On the one extreme, you have somebody like Penei Sewell, 6'6", 350-pound lineman for the Detroit Lions, who absolutely destroyed the Packers defense twice last year. I don't sound bitter, do I? And on the other hand, you have the ultimate girly girl, Ms. Taylor Swift. Now, I don't know much about Taylor Swift, but I can tell you this. I am impressed any time that the price of a ticket to someone's concert sets off a congressional investigation. So, Gender dysphoria, a couple more things you need to know about it. The diagnostic label gender identity disorder, GID, was used until 2013 when the condition was reclassified to remove the stigma associated with the term disorder. Supposedly, this stigma was keeping a lot of young people from getting the help they needed, and they went right to doing bad things to themselves, so they thought maybe they could change some of that by changing the definition. It is not considered a mental disorder, but the distress, discomfort, and dissatisfaction may become so intense that it can lead to a mental disorder, like depression, anxiety, suicidality, and can make a harmful impact on daily life. Now that sounds like which came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't think we need to figure that out. That was all done for the same purpose, to lessen the stigma. Persistent gender dysphoria can lead to hopelessness as measured by the Beck Hopelessness Scale. I didn't even know there was such a thing. But it says hopelessness is a state of mind which often precedes thoughts of suicide. The ongoing debate about the classification of gender dysphoria. One group wants it labeled a medical condition so that they can get insurance coverage for it. The other group wants to remove the stigma, so they prefer the mismatch classification. Interesting. So at the end of the day, the definition and description of gender dysphoria, is it a biological condition or a psychological word salad? Is it intended to illuminate or manipulate? I don't have the answer to that. So I'm going to consult an expert. This is Helena Kirshner. She's not somebody who wears a lab coat. She's 23 years old and she was diagnosed with gender dysphoria at 15. She's smart, she's articulate, and she gives a great YouTube message in under 5 minutes. There's just one caveat. She did it during an interview with Tucker Carlson from Fox News. Now, I know he's a bit polarizing, but I could not find the same video on any of the other major networks. And so if you're one of those people who doesn't like Carlson or Fox News, I'm just going to ask you to suspend your dislike long enough to listen to our friend Helena, who really has something to say. When I see this video, and I've watched it a few dozen times, I can just kind of hear the emotional pain, the psychological pain from what she's been through. According to Abigail Schreier, Americans are having a tremendous amount of psychological pain, especially those born after 1995. They experience high levels of depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. They spend too much time on the internet and too little time with each other. They miss out on the hugs and tears that come with personal contact. An emoji on their smartphones is not a substitute for personal contact. What's ironic is we saw more signs of psychological health in southern Sudan, which is arguably the poorest country in the world. My daughter was a missionary there, and the people barely have enough to eat. Their grass huts are constantly being consumed by the termites. And as you can see, they wear hand-me-down clothing that nobody else wanted. Now, who can tell me why nobody else wanted that shirt he's wearing? The wrong number for Jordan? And how about that spelling? But they're happy to have it because not too many years ago they wore no clothing. So, in any case, why is it that a place like southern Sudan, they have good psychological health? Well, as I walked through the village at night, I could see that there were people gathered around the fire, families where the kids were playing, the adults were talking, laughing, cheering, clapping, just enjoying each other's company. And there's a reason they do that there. And that's because of this. No TV, no internet, no cell phones. It turns out it's a very healthy thing for them. But when I see Helena Kirshner, I also think victim. Helena is not a bad person. She's not stupid. She's not mentally ill by any means. Her transgression was that she followed some bad advice. Anybody here ever follow bad advice? If following bad advice was a crime, I'd be sentenced to life in prison. So where did this bad advice come from? Well, Helena says that young folks are being deceived. And I don't know if you can read that real clearly or not, but the most dangerous liars are those who think they are telling the truth. Who are they? Well, the educators that are inserting radical sexual agendas into the school curriculum. I mean, let's face it, does a kindergartner really need to hear that a transgender person is someone the doctors made a mistake about when they were born? Well, no wonder they don't have time to teach cursive handwriting anymore. And then there's the trans influencers, or groomers as they're called. Kai West Bigwood used to be a girl. Jazz Jennings used to be a boy. They now spend their time online trying to convince young people that if they get a gender transition, it will solve all their problems. And then there's the mental health professionals. The American Psychological Association mandates, did you catch that word mandate? Mandates healthcare professionals to affirm a teenage girl's feelings when she says, "I think I'm really a boy." I mean, think about that. The people who could help these young folks sort out what's going on in their brain, they're told what they can and cannot say. Dr. Miriam Grossman, a child psychiatrist, is on a crusade. She remembers there was one young man who showed up at the therapist's office with all the classic signs of schizophrenia. And yet, because he said the wrong thing in just the right way, they were forced to send him to a transgender clinic instead. And then there's a medical profession. $2.1 billion industry and growing, thanks to the Affordable Care Act, which mandates that health insurance companies pay for treatment. I have put the Vanderbilt School of Medicine on here because not too long ago, one of their administrators was caught on video talking to a group of young doctors. And she was telling them, you need to do more transgender surgeries. And the reason she gave was not anything to do with the kids' health. It was all about making money for the hospital. And then there's the cyber bullies. Nearly half of U.S. teens have been bullied or harassed online, according to Emily Vogels. Physical stature and physical appearance is the most common reason why. Now, as I tried to get some statistics on this, it's a lot easier to find out the number of transgender children or young people who have already been bullied. What they don't have is any numbers on how many kids were bullied before they got diagnosed with transgender dysphoria. That would be an interesting thing to find out. And then there's the adults with the hidden agendas. In America, there are 780,000 registered sex offenders and 40 million regular porn consumers. And they have tallied this on the internet. Now, the relationship between the drag queens and these offenders is not very clear, but this is what Paul McHugh talks about from Johns Hopkins. He says, for adult male transitioners, it's all about sex. He said a good number of them are gay men trying to assuage their guilt. Evidently, they feel that if they change genders and do what they were doing, it doesn't make them feel guilty. I'm not sure I follow that. But then there's this thing called autogynephilia. This is when a man gets aroused looking at himself in the mirror when he's dressed like a woman. Now, these guys are thoroughly heterosexual, so it is very dangerous to allow them into female bathrooms, locker rooms, prisons, the like. And then there's the politicians and the news media. As you know, the politicians cater to their voters. The news media caters to their viewers. And between them, the likelihood of getting any truth is slim and none. And unfortunately, the young people are listening, and they can get all kinds of crazy ideas this way. And then there's the Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court decision of 2015, the one that legalized same-sex marriage. In the process, it empowered and even energized the LGBT community. Now, what does empowered and energized look like? Well, ask Jack Phillips, the Colorado baker, who became the recipient of lawsuits, boycotts, and death threats because he refused to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding because of his Christian principles. It took him several years and a lot of dollars to finally become exonerated by the Supreme Court of the United States. And ironically, shortly after he was vindicated, another lawsuit arrived from a transgender attorney who wanted to sue him because he refused to bake a cake for her gender transition. She later admitted that it was a setup, but the message was real clear. The LGBT community is energized and empowered, and you better not mess with us. And then there's the NCAA. You know, everybody in America, I think, knows that it's unfair for a biologic male, no matter what he calls himself, to compete against a biologic female. But fairness isn't even the biggest issue. It's the danger of it. Go ahead, Paul. Okay, we're going to play that again in just a second. The young man who spiked the ball, he's a young man who identifies as a female and is now competing on a high school girls volleyball team. Watch this again and listen to what happens when the ball hits her head. She left the game with a concussion, but further testing demonstrated that she may have permanent brain damage. So, should biologic males compete against biologic females? I think most of us know the answer to that. So, Abigail Schreier asks, is a standard guided by political correctness rather than biology in the best interest of the athletes? I think you know the answer to that question. Who is Abigail Schreier? Well, she wrote a book about 3 years ago, and it was entitled Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. For having the courage to present some inconvenient truths, if you will, she got canceled, censored, criticized, ostracized, demonized, deplatformed, harassed, and even booed off the stage. I listened to a podcast of a speech she gave at Hillsdale College, and she must have thanked the audience at least half a dozen times for not harassing her. But before I say anything more about her, I'd like you to hear from Abigail Schreier herself. Just to recap, in 2012, 1 out of 10,000 high school students were affected. Now it's 1 out of 50 high school students, and in some schools they say 1 out of 10. Mostly boys aged 2 to 4, just a decade ago. Now it's mostly teenage girls with no history of gender dysphoria. 2012, there were 2 gender clinics in America. Now there are over 300. And I don't know if you remember back in about a decade ago, there was great concerns about this barbaric procedure called female circumcision that women were going through all over the world. Well, now here we are just a decade later, and our culture is promoting genital mutilation for the sake of gender transitioning. What's going on? And it's not limited to the East Coast, the West Coast, or Appalachia. It's going on right here in metropolitan Milwaukee. There's one high school teacher I know, suburban Milwaukee High School, who says there's at least 12 young ladies wanting to change their pronouns. And if only it was about pronouns, that'd be all right. But you see, once a young lady has been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, she'll go on puberty blockers if she's the right age, or she'll go on hormone therapy to enhance the masculinization. And if the testosterone seems to give her a little boost, she'll consider top surgery to remove her breasts. And in the worst case scenario, a lot of them will opt for bottom surgery, just to remove the female organs so that they can resolve this internal conflict. And after that, there's multiple medical visits for the side effects of the hormone and gender-affirming surgery. But why did the number of transgender surgeries quadruple between 2016 and 17? Like Vince Lombardi said, what's going on here? Better question yet, what happened in 2015? Well, it's in 2015 that gender dysphoria became a social contagion. Let me define that for you. According to Psychology Today, it's the tendency for people to mimic the behavior of others to whom they have been exposed, even if this exposure is only through the media. It results from the heightened suggestibility of a particular group, for example, teenage girls, and likens the process to the spread of a contagious disease. Abigail Shrier describes it as a characteristic of teenage girls to find themselves in the grip of the prevailing social contagion, be it anorexia, multiple personality disorder, repressed memories, or gender dysphoria. They share their pain, they spread their pain, and they magnify it in each other until each of the girls in their social circle has been self-diagnosed with the same problem. Now, never having been a teenage girl, I can't quite relate to this, but when I talked to my wife, she understood it completely. She really did enjoy this book, written by Abigail Shrier. I like the facts, but Chris, my wife, really identified with a lot of the pain of just being a teenage girl and what that means. So I highly recommend it, even though she's not a Christian. She believes in God. So that's a good start, I think. Anyway, today's transgender social contagion began to take shape in 1976 at the Montreal Olympics. That's when this young man named Bruce Jenner set an Olympic decathlon record and became a darling of the media in the process. For his efforts, he was rewarded with a gold medal for the Olympics, meaning he's the best of the best of the best. And he was rewarded by having his image appear on a box of Wheaties, the breakfast of champions. Now, you may not think that's a big deal, but that really puts him in a category with some of the greatest athletes of all times. Now, truly, in the 1970s, Bruce Jenner was considered the ultimate American male. Now, fast forward to 2015, and Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn Jenner. The ultimate American male became a female. Now, I want you to pay attention to this slide, so nudge that person next to you if they look like they're falling asleep. When a rich, famous, talented celebrity transitioned, overnight, it became okay to be transgender. The stigma had been removed. What stigma, you ask? Well, in 2013, the average American viewed transgenders as losers, as misfits, or even as mentally ill, which I think is especially stigmatizing because it puts you in a category with the likes of Charles Manson, the absolute poster child for mental illness, or Jeffrey Dahmer, Wisconsin's most notorious serial killer, or even Darrell Brooks, the psychopath who put Waukesha, Wisconsin on the map one Sunday afternoon. But you see, after 2015, transgenders were no longer considered losers. An Olympic gold medalist is not a loser, therefore transgenders can't be considered losers either. And when Jenner became a hot celebrity again, transgenders could no longer be considered misfits, because in America, no celebrity is ever considered a misfit. And when Jenner received the Arthur Ashe Award for courage, trans people could no longer be accused of mental illness. They are now considered courageous. And it may sound a little bit crazy to suggest that transgenderism and gender dysphoria is a social contagion, but there are historical precedents. Consider the eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. These disorders were once considered wasting disease, dating back to the Middle Ages. But it was not until the 1980s that studies were done which focused on these disorders. So what happened in the 1980s, you ask? That's when Karen Carpenter died of anorexia, just 1 month short of her 33rd birthday. You see, prior to Karen Carpenter's death, females with eating disorders were treated with condescension. After her death, they were treated with compassion. And much in the same way as it was with Jenner. When a rich, famous, talented celebrity succumbed to anorexia, the stigma of mental illness associated with eating disorders immediately disappeared. In the 1990s, the social contagion was repressed memories of childhood trauma. A pastor friend of mine told me there was an epidemic of repressed memories at Elmbrook Church about that time. And it all seemed to coincide with the revelation that Oprah Winfrey had been seeing a therapist for repressed memories of childhood trauma. In the 1970s, the historical precedent for social contagions was multiple personality disorder, and it all seemed to follow a movie about Sybil, who was suffering from that very thing. Now, it wasn't that young ladies were terribly attracted to Sybil. Sybil turned out to be quite a pathetic character. She even lied about a number of the things that were portrayed in the movie. What young ladies were attracted to was this bond that formed between Sally Field, who played the role of Sybil, and Joanna Woodward, the therapist. It was just such a warm, loving bond that I think the young ladies decided they liked that kind of thing. And this combination of a tearjerker of a movie combined with all the celebrities involved in it was enough, evidently, to make multiple personality disorder a social contagion. Now, the transgender community does not like being told that this is a social contagion. But the question is, where's the science? So far, they have not put forth a lot of science about gender dysphoria. If you remember, during the pandemic, we were constantly being told, follow the science, follow the science, follow the science. But they're not talking about that now that it's transgender dysphoria. We're going to show you a little clip about what passes for gender dysphoria science. Well, there's a lot we can say about that, isn't there? But I say you never rush an inadequate solution. And that's exactly what they're touting in this. I have a 10-year-old grandson who cried last year when the Brewers traded Josh Hader. That's what 10-year-olds should be doing, crying about baseball, not having to make a decision about what gender they want to be for the rest of their life. But bad science leads to bad outcomes, and this is the end result of gender transition. Infertility, sexual dysfunction, an infinite array of medical procedures, long-term pain or disability from said medical procedures, continued depression and anxiety, cutting, self-harm, self-injury, substance and or alcohol abuse, roughly 3 times the rate of the national average, and attempted suicide and painful detransition, often both. Now, sorry, I'm going to ad-lib a little bit. Hope this doesn't carry us too long, but I think we tend to look at the bottom 6 as being far more serious than 1 and 2. But 1 and 2, if that didn't happen, would the other 6 happen? What we've done by pushing kids to make a decision so early in life is to sacrifice the possibility of having a normal marriage and having a normal family with children. Now, I know that many people get along without being married and having children, and they do fine. But I'm one of the people in life who needed to be married and have children to grow up. I didn't become a responsible adult until I was married and had children. And something about having kids just makes you become a giver instead of a taker. And I'm wondering if that isn't what some of these young kids need. You know, if you're 15, it's normal to have life all about yourself. But something about being a husband or wife and a parent changes a lot of things. And I think I'm ad-libbing too long, and I've got somewhere to be tomorrow, so we're just going to move along here. This is the irreversible damage of the transgender craze that is seducing our daughters and granddaughters. And so to accurately follow the science of gender dysphoria, we must go back to the beginning and ask some basic questions, such as, where did I come from? And how did humans become male and female in the first place? Well, there are 2 options for where did I come from. And as you can imagine, you need to choose correctly if you want a positive outcome. The one option is what we call the naturalistic view of science, which is synonymous with the theory of evolution. And the other is the supernaturalistic view of science, which is synonymous with biblical creation. Now, naturalistic science says that the beginning of life on Earth was when lightning struck a warm pond more than 1 billion years ago, and voila, suddenly life appeared. And life has evolved quite naturally ever since through random mutations and natural selection. And it's no surprise that the trans community's preference is naturalistic science. That's what's being taught in the public schools and the universities. It's what's being taught in the media and by non-genicist adults. The word non-genicist, yes, I made that up. It refers to anyone who hasn't read the book of Genesis, or they did and they didn't believe it. So it's also because the trans community prefers naturalistic science because it's not hate speech. All this stuff in Genesis about male and female being created in God's image, in some parts of the world, people have been arrested for using hate speech, for quoting the Bible. But what they really like about it is the emphasis on random mutations. Gender dysphoria requires a certain randomness, like the roll of the dice. According to the National Institute of Health, it is random mutations which have created the mismatch between body parts and gender identity. In fact, one reporter from the Cincinnati Post declared the miracle of random mutations. He says, chemical processes brought forth simple organisms which, through random mutations, evolved into us. To me, that's a greater miracle than if God had simply spoke it all into existence, ready-made. Think about that. But he did say one true thing there. The miracle of random mutations. It would be a miracle if random mutations could do everything they say it does. You see, the problem with mutations is that they are usually harmful or neutral at best. According to Dr. Georgia Purdome, I have never seen evidence of a truly beneficial mutation. And she tells about the research she did on the 3 blind mice. These mice were missing 3 bases in their DNA. That's 3 bases out of millions. And therefore, they were missing 1 amino acid from 1 protein in every cell. That's out of 100,000 proteins. And as a result of this very minor mutation, The 3 mice were blind and deaf. The albino had a deficient immune system, osteoporosis, no teeth, and died soon after weaning. That's from just one small mutation. So people say, well, what about beneficial mutations? A mutation means that something changes. Now, what can you change on this painting that would make it any better than it is? Every mutation is harmful or neutral at best. But they want the best of both worlds. You see, if gender dysphoria is caused by a mutation, then it is a biological condition, so that the gender dysphoric patient can get insurance to cover medical treatment. At the same time, because it is a biological condition, there is no stigma of mental illness attached. So everyone's happy. Until they read more about this National Institute of Health conclusion. The causes of gender incongruence are unknown, but a gender identity likely reflects genetic, biological, environmental, and cultural factors. Treatment for dysphoria may include supporting the individual's gender expression or their desire for hormone therapy or surgery. Treatment may also include counseling or psychotherapy. How is that if it's a biological condition that counseling and psychotherapy is needed? There's a little bit of doublespeak going on here. But the worst part is when these young transgenders start reading more about the theory of evolution. In fact, a lot of the evolutionists don't want this information out because it doesn't favor so well on their reputation. You see, according to the process of evolution, random mutations cause biologic changes. The trans community is okay with that. But then natural selection then weeds out the unhelpful changes, which gets them thinking a little bit. What do they mean, unhelpful? And then natural selection selects whatever traits enable an organism to survive and procreate, while eliminating the organisms plagued by the unhelpful mutations that inhibit procreation. That's when the light goes on. And then they realize that since gender dysphoria does not promote procreation, especially when gender transition has taken place, gender dysphoria will eventually be eliminated by natural selection. Kind of like what evolution said happened to the dodo bird. Now, if you've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, how would it make you feel to know that you are damaged goods, like a dodo bird that is living with a harmful mutation which natural selection wants to weed out? I'm betting your self-esteem is going to go way down and your depression and anxiety is going to go way up. But that's not all. What does evolution say about you as a human being? Well, you see, with evolution as a starting point, we are forced to conclude that human beings are just a byproduct of natural, random, accidental processes. And if so, you are the result of a long list of accidents, a product of evolutionary progression. Because your existence is purely accidental, your life has no value, no meaning, no purpose. Given the theoretical origin of life, you yourself are nothing more than rearranged pond scum. And when it's over, your lifeless body will lie in the cold, hard ground forever. Now, for a hardened criminal, this probably sounds like good news. But for a young person dealing with low self-esteem and suicidal thoughts, the reality of naturalistic science forces them to think about, where do I fit in? If life is all about survival of the fittest, they have to wonder, am I one of the less fit? Am I an organism that natural selection wants to weed out, like a single-winged bird or a three-legged dog? Well, this all sounds a little harsh, I realize, but this is not me talking now. This comes from people like evolutionary biologist, the late Stephen Jay Gould. He said, if it offends Christian morality or a sentimental belief in human unity, so be it. Science must be free to proclaim unpleasant truths. So is it any wonder then that those who follow the naturalistic science wind up experiencing dysphoria and hopelessness? The National Library of Medicine says that 86% of transgender youth have thought about killing themselves. This is called suicidality. 56% of transgender youth reported a previous suicide attempt. And low self-esteem makes a unique, statistically significant contribution to suicidality. So what should be done to help them? Well, according to educators, psychologists, doctors, politicians, the media, and the LGBT community, the solution to the problem of low self-esteem and suicidality associated with gender dysphoria is, drumroll, a gender transition. That's going to solve all your problems. Actually, it's going to create irreversible damage that you cannot make up for. I'd rather get some good advice from, say, somebody with boots on the ground, somebody who actually works in the trenches. One such person was a patient of mine named Mary Ann Seipt. I met her, I'm going to say in the 1980s, and she had already been working at Waukesha County Hospital's psychiatric unit for almost 30 years by that time. I want you to hear what Mary Ann Seipt has to say about it. In the past, we didn't see all these young people trying to kill themselves because they were afraid of going to hell for committing suicide. I think it all changed when they started teaching evolution in the public schools. If you aren't sure about when that was, the biological scientific curriculum studies around 1958 began pushing schools to insert evolution into the curriculum. So by the early 60s, evolution was being taught everywhere in the schools. But here's what Mary Ann Seipt said. I think it all changed when they started teaching evolution in the public schools. She's not talking about gender dysphoria or any other social contagion. She's laying the blame squarely on the theory of evolution. Could it be that if the theory of evolution leads to low self-esteem and suicide, we should be considering an alternative explanation for how we got here? Something like maybe the supernaturalistic view of science? Well, let's do that for a moment. Let's follow the creator science. You are not an accident. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. You are not rearranged pond scum. You are made a little lower than the angels and crowned with glory and honor. Now, your life may not seem glorious and honorable right now, but that's only because you haven't gotten to the final chapter just yet. You are not the product of random mutations. Your Creator knit you together in your mother's womb. And according to Pastor Charles Stanley, who said this many times in the years I've been watching him, if God didn't want you to be who you are, he would have made you into someone else. Let's think about that. You are just who God wanted you to be. And you were created for a purpose. God said to the first human beings, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. God did not create the earth to be empty. He formed it to be inhabited, even if sometimes the inhabitants look more like penguins. You know, if you want to get a good laugh sometime, get on Wikipedia and look up the evolution of a penguin. They readily say that the penguins gave up their ability to fly so that they could dive below the surface of ice-cold waters, searching for fish and krill, the whole time dodging leopard seals and the killer whales that want to make use out of them for dinner. Now, I find that whole explanation very laughable, if it wasn't so tragic that there are people who actually believe it. So, the supernaturalistic explanation about human beings, it is far more appealing than the naturalistic version. But how do we know which one is true? Well, that's where the Creation Science Society of Milwaukee comes in. The naturalistic view is not settled science. That's what we are here to tell people. There are just too many questions it cannot answer. For example, where did the universe come from? How did life begin? Where did DNA come from? If you would have been at February's meeting, you would have heard all about this from Boyd Roloff, who gave a great explanation and answered all three of those questions from the supernaturalistic point of view. And number 4, what caused the Cambrian explosion and where are all the transitional fossils? Jerry Fry gave a great explanation back in November about both of these and explained that the fossil record does not support evolution, contrary to what you may have heard in the media. And number 6, why are there fossils of sea creatures high up on Mount Everest? And why is there soft tissue in dinosaur bones, even though they supposedly died 65 million years ago? Well, if you had been at our meeting in January, you would have heard Jay Siegert give a very good explanation of all this. And then number 8, why do billion-year-old zirconia crystals still contain helium? Spoiler alert, they don't. If there's still helium in the zirconia crystal, it's not more than 1,000 years old. And yet they tell you it's billions of years. Dwayne Caldwell touched on that when he spoke to us back in October. And then there's number 9, how did heterosexual reproduction evolve? Well, you're going to have to come back in April to find out about that one. And it is a great story. The point is, if it cannot answer any of these basic questions, the entire theory of evolution is dead on arrival. Science cannot prove the existence of God, but science has proven that there is no alternative explanation for who we are and how we got here. The one and only cure for gender dysphoria is to follow the Creator's science. And now, we're going to come to the very best part of the program tonight. I'd like to introduce you to a man named Walt Heyer, who did follow the Creator's science at the right time in his life. It's a very moving story, so this is not the time to leave, even if you're sick of listening to me, because this is the very best part of the program. Quite the story, isn't it? So, just to touch on a couple of the highlights of that. Walt Heyer wrote down all the ways he had been abused and then all the ways he had hurt people that he loved by the bad decisions he made. His therapist then set the piece of paper on fire and watched the smoke dissipate into the wind. Walt said he felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. Isn't that a poignant and accurate picture of what Jesus did for us on the cross when he died to take away our sins? And Walt saw Jesus coming towards him, offering him unconditional love and acceptance. You know, the one thing we all in this room have in common is we all want to be loved and accepted for who we really are. And we'd like to get that from the people around us, but they can't give it. Everybody around us is a sinful human being. The only one who can give us total, unconditional love and acceptance is Jesus Christ. Jesus told Walt, "Your life will be safe with me forever," not just for his time on earth, but for all of eternity. Walt's body will not lie in the cold, hard ground forever. God will make everything new. There will be no more death or mourning or weeping or pain, because the old order of things will pass away. Would you join me in prayer? Our Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for who you are, for what you have done for us, and for the fact that you have blessed us by opening our eyes to the truth. To know that the book of Genesis and the whole Bible is accurate and literally true just gives us such an advantage in coping with all of the stuff in life that just seems to overwhelm people in our world. And Father, I want to pray for that world. I want to pray for all the young people who are being misled into gender transitioning because they just don't have anybody who's telling them the truth. And I also want to pray for those who have already gone through it. May you help them to detransition or at least forgive themselves and the people around them and get back to living a new life. Father, there's just so many things about this movement that are clearly not from you, and yet you are bigger than all of them. And so I ask you to just take the whole gender dysphoria movement and the theory of evolution and give it what it deserves. Save the people who are involved in it, enlighten the people who are telling the lies, and in the end, help everyone to come to Jesus, the only one who can give us the unconditional love and acceptance that we all desire. For it's in his name we pray. Amen.